Students, we are going to study about the drugs acting on the respiratory system. But before starting to that particular topic directly, we'll just discuss a brief introduction about the respiratory system. So, in this video, we will study about the respiratory system. The human respiratory system is one of the most vital organ systems of the body. The oxygen of the atmospheric air is delivered to the human body, which is then utilized by all the tissues, and the carbon dioxide, which is produced by the human body, is exported to the lungs and then exchanged with the atmospheric air. That we all know already. Now, in this video, we will first talk about the brief anatomy and physiology of the human respiratory system so that you can understand more in detail about the drugs acting on respiratory system. And then we will discuss how the gas transport occurs. We will talk about how the human respiratory system works together with the circulatory system, and then we will talk about how the gas exchange happens in the alveoli, just in a brief. Already you people have studied this in the anatomy and physiology in the first year of B Pharma. So, one more important point, we will also discuss some MCQs for the GPAT exam after finishing this topic. So, first coming to the anatomy and physiology of the human respiratory system. In this, the vocal cords present in the larynx divide the respiratory tract into upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract. The upper respiratory tract contains structures like the nasal cavity, the pharynx, and the part of the larynx above the vocal cords. And the lower respiratory tract starts with the part of the larynx below the vocal folds, then trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, as well as the alveoli. So let's first talk about the brief anatomy of the nose and the nasal cavity. Now, if we take a look at this diagram in a bit detail, we can see that the nasal cavity is made up of a roof, which is in turn made up of the bones forming the base of the skull. It also consists of a floor, which is made up of the palatine bones. The main job of a nose and the nasal cavity in the respiratory tract is the filtration of air. And this is made possible by small minute hair-like structures present in the nasal cavity called cilia. So the filtration of air is also facilitated by the mucus, which is secreted by the nasal walls. This traps dust, pollens, as well as other pollutants present in the atmospheric air before entering into the nose cavity. And the other job that the nasal cavity performs is a warming and humidification of the air, which prevents the dryness in the respiratory membranes. Also, oral cavity plays important roles. Oral cavity also serves as a secondary opening for the expiratory tract. The downside of this is that there is no filtration, no humidification, and no temperature regulation through the oral cavity. We know it. But there is a plus side also, which is that the oral cavity has a wider opening. So it facilitates greater intake of air during, for example, exercise. So till now we have studied the air that we inhale passes through our nasal cavity or the oral cavity into the pharynx. So coming to the next important structure in the human respiratory tract, which is the pharynx. Pharynx is basically a muscular tube which lies behind the nose in the mouth as well as the larynx. And it connects the oral and nasal cavity to the larynx as well as the esophagus. Now the part in the purple you see is the part which is called the nasopharynx. This is the part which lies behind the nasal cavity. The second part of the pharynx is called the oropharynx, which is the part in the blue which lies behind the oral cavity. And the third is called the hypopharynx, which lies behind the larynx, which is in the green color. So the air that we inhale through our nose or to our oral cavity passes back into the pharynx. That we understood, right? Now, when the air reaches the pharynx, it has two important structures where it can go forward. So, the first is the trachea, which lies in the front, and second is the esophagus, which lies to the back of a trachea. Normally, the air enters in the trachea at normal conditions. One important structure to note here is the epiglottis. So, the epiglottis is basically a cartilaginous structure which closes the entry of the pharyngea and prevent entry of food. It is an elastic cartilage which closes the laryngeal inlet and prevents entry of food into the trachea and further the lungs. So, the next important structure in the respiratory tract is the larynx. The larynx is located right here, and it also known as the voice box as well as the Adam's apple. And larynx is made up of many cartilages, and larynx contains the vocal cords. uh, and the main function of the larynx in the human respiratory system is that it connects the pharynx to the trachea. So it is the in between part of this. The next important structure is the trachea. So the trachea is basically a tube like structure which connects the larynx to the bronchi, and the bronchi in turn connect to the lungs. If we take a closer look at the section of the trachea, we can see that the trachea is basically made up of 20 C-shaped cartilages. And from above to below, these cartilages basically prevent the collapse of the trachea because there is a negative pressure in trachea as well as the lungs during inhalation. If you see closely, these tracheal rings are basically C-shaped. These are not completely circular because esophagus lies just behind the trachea. And if these rings were circular, they would have compressed to the during swallowing, and this could have led to choking the trachea then the trachea then divides into the primary bronchi. Now this is called the primary bronchi. You can see in the figure, because it is in the first division of the trachea, the primary bronchi then divides into the secondary bronchioles. Then secondary bronchioles again divided into the tertiary bronchioles. And what happens next? The is that these tertiary bronchioles again divided for about 20 divisions to form the conducting bronchioles. So it's like a network. So you can see the tertiary bronchioles divide many times to form very small sac-like structures, and the tertiary bronchioles lead into the conducting bronchioles, and the conducting bronchioles then form a 4 to 5 division series of respiratory bronchioles. These respiratory bronchioles are in turn connected to the alveoli finally. Now, these alveoli are sac-like structures in which actual gas exchange happens. The conducting bronchioles are called conducting bronchioles because no gas exchange happens in them, since they have large or thick walls. But respiratory bronchioles have very thin walls, and some amount of gas exchange can happen in these respiratory bronchioles. So, but majority of the gas exchange happens in the alveoli because of their close proximity to the blood vessels. And the division of the bronchioles to such an extent increases the effective surface area of the lungs. So, the air that we inhale finally reaches into the alveoli. Now, let's look at this diagram to understand how the respiratory system of our body works in conjunction with the circulatory system to provide the gas exchange. Now in this diagram you can see the lungs and the heart as well as the circulation pool of the body, showing the deoxygenated blood in a blue color as well as the oxygenated blood in the pink or red color. This is the superficial diagram, but when I'm talking, you just listen it carefully and understand and imagine. So basically the heart receives all the deoxygenated blood from the body. through the superior as well as the inferior vena cava. This we know already in the previous chapter. This blood has a low concentration of oxygen and thus is then pumped to the lungs through the pulmonary arteries in the lungs. So this deoxygenated blood is subjected to gas exchange, which converts it into oxygenated blood, which is pumped back to the heart. Then this heart then pumps this oxygenated blood to the body, which utilizes the oxygen present in this blood. And again, this blood is converted into deoxygenated blood, which is pumped back to the heart. And the heart pumps all the deoxygenated blood to the lungs through two main arteries, the right and the left pulmonary artery. Just as we saw in the previous slides with the branching pattern, that single bronchus almost divides 20 to 25 times before the formation of the alveoli. The similar phenomenon happens with the large blood vessels that entered into the lungs. Now these blood vessels also divide several times, which leads to the formation of small capillaries that are in extremely close contact with the alveoli. Due to this, the cardiac output that comes in the large vessels divides into many small streams of blood. This leads to exposure of the 5 liters of blood coming through the heart, almost 250 to 300 million alveoli per minute. So you can imagine the micro level functioning of all these things. So due to this, a rapid gaseous exchange happens between the alveolar air and the blood that is exposed to the alveoli. Now let's try to understand how the actual gas transport happens inside this. So the air that we inhale passes through a respiratory tract deep into our body, into a bunch of structures called alveoli. Well, this is important to create a very less distance between the alveolar air and the blood furnace. So on this, take a closer look at this section of an alveoli. In the previous slide, what I have shown you, the closed section of the alveoli, the bunch, which are attached to the end of the respiratory bronchioles. Now you can imagine that a bunch of alveoli are surrounded closely by blood vessels. If we take a single alveoli, out of which bunch and magnify it under microscope, we can see that the alveoli is completely surrounded by a single capillary, but in reality they are surrounded by multiple capillaries to have a very close contact with the blood, as we have seen in this diagram in the trachea section, right? So you can see clearly that the air that we inhale in the alveoli is a very close proximity, which is approximately few micrometers from the blood vessel. Here comes a role of difference in the concentration of gases on either side. So most of you know that the diffusion occurs due to the difference in concentration of substance on either side. So if we take a look at the concentration difference of the alveolar air and the blood of carbon dioxide and oxygen, we can see that the alveolar air has a low concentration of carbon dioxide as compared to the blood, which has a higher concentration. Whereas opposite of that is true in case of oxygen, where high concentration of oxygen is present in the alveolar air as compared to low concentration of oxygen in the blood. So due to this, the high concentration of carbon dioxide is exchanged with the alveolar air, and the carbon dioxide is released outside in the atmosphere, whereas the fresh oxygen that is coming through the alveolar air is transported to the blood. This is a little bit tricky. You have to concentrate and listen it carefully and then revise. So definitely you will understand. It's very simple actually. And the blood is made oxygenated. So the blood coming on one side of the capillary, which is a deoxygenated blood, it's converted into oxygenated blood. On the other side, this oxygenated blood is then sent to the heart, and the heart then pumps this oxygenated blood to whole of the body, which is then utilized. So this was a brief description of the human respiratory system. I hope you found this video helpful. Thank you for watching and listening this explanation. Here are some MCQs on the anatomy and physiology of respiratory system. In this, you can just have a look and revise it. Whatever the red mark I have given, that are the answers of this question. Like first is where are the lungs located? So 4 options are given. The answer is a mediastinum of thoracic cavity. Then the pleural membrane is of serous membrane. How many lobes are present in the right lung? So 3 lobes are there. Then the oblique fissures of right lung separates which of the 2 lobes, inferior lobe to the part of superior lobe. This is actually the anatomy and physiology which you people have studied in the first year, obviously. But as we are going to study the drugs acting on the respiratory system, it's necessary to just have a brief idea about this. That's why we have covered this. These are some questions on the same respiratory system, and yeah, same. Then this is one. Just have a look, and if you want, you can note down all these questions. Thank you for listening me. Have a great day.